Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. My name is Erin Brown. I am Program Director here for the Ignatian Solidarity Network. I'm really excited today to welcome Jimmy Menkhaus, who is a longtime friend and partner of ISN, to share with us insights from Pedro Arrupe for Immersion. So I don't want to take up too much of his time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over right to Jimmy. And we are recording this session, so we'll share that out after.
And hello, everyone. I really appreciate people taking the time to sit in front of a computer for another roughly hour after so often many of us are sitting in front of computers all day. And so I'm very grateful that you took the time to spend this with us today, talking about something that I think all of us on the call believe is something important, and that is immersion programs. So what I'm thinking in terms of how this will go is I'll talk for 20, 25 minutes or so about a few ideas, and then open the floor for any questions or discussion, or if other people want to chime in and share some of their experiences or their reactions or things that have worked well in terms of some of the content that I'll be talking about. It would be great to have your participation. And we'll explain kind of an orderly way for us to do that after my opening comments. Last month, I was giving a talk for the Holy Cross schools for their high schools and colleges on a few of the similar topics that I'm talking about today. And I had to be very careful not to use the A word too often at a Holy Cross institution, because the A word, of course, being Arrupe. I didn't want the Holy Cross folks to think that they had been suckered into watching a Jesuit talk. But here we can use the Arrupe word all we want, because it's an ISN event. So it's great to be able to talk about Arrupe, someone that I'm very passionate about, and look forward to sharing some stories about. I think that, in terms of the knowledge that people at Jesuit high schools and colleges have concerning Arrupe is often, people can point to, oh, there's an Arrupe building or an Arrupe statue, or, we have this after school thing called Arrupe, or this service program called Arrupe. But often students know very little actually about who Arrupe was. And so when I talk to students at high schools or colleges or ISN events, I ask them this and then try to encourage them to find out more about Arrupe. Because so many of our students, I think, know the Ignatian story like the back of their hand, like it's their own. The cannonball wound, and then the time at Manresa, and then Ignatius did this, and that's all really important. But I think Arrupe who was by some Jesuits kind of considered a second founder, is really important for people to know too. And so I think some of the stories I'm going to share today about Arrupe hopefully are things that you can apply in your own way, your own context at your own schools. In terms of immersion work. So that's really the hope that I have for our session and my comments today. I think that this session also dovetails nicely with what Susan and Annie talked about last month in terms of immersions and whiteness and some of the racial issues of coming to realize how immersions are done at our schools. And if you haven't seen the recording from last month or haven't read their document that they put out, their publication on immersions and whiteness, I definitely recommend that as a great resource. And so I hope that my comments kind of continue the discussion that we began to have last month and connect to that as well. And finally, thank you to ISN for the opportunity to speak today. I'll talk a little bit towards the end about the book that I recently wrote that was mentioned on immersion programs, and much of the stuff that I'll talk about today comes from that book as a resource. So we'll talk more at the end. So again, ultimately, my hope today is to share some aspects of the Arrupe narrative and then to try to apply them in ways that connect to immersion work. I myself have never been an immersion coordinator at either a high school or university. I did teach courses at university where I created an immersion within the course and embedded that. And I've been on a number of immersion experiences as a faculty and staff member, and I've also worked with postgraduate volunteer programs. But I have not done the job that many of you on this call have done or are doing. And so I certainly don't want anything to come across that I'm saying that I know how to do your job better than you. What we're going to be talking about, again, should be adapted in whatever way that you decide to. And it's not for me to tell you how we should do that. But at our schools, at Jesuit schools, the idea of, as you all know, a faith that does justice can be a very difficult balance to have in terms of how do we invite students to appropriate aspects of a faith tradition and at the same time see that as a call to work for justice, especially when we're working with people who come from a variety of faith backgrounds. Some people, I'm sure, we've all worked with students who identify as agnostic or atheist, or who identify as a non-Christian religion. So how can we stay authentic to the reality of the Jesuit mission and to the background of the Jesuits, and at the same time be inviting to folks to see that the work for justice isn't just a Catholic thing, isn't just a person who believes in God sort of thing, but is open to everyone. And I do think that there's a way that we can invoke or look to a figure like Pedro Arrupe and many others who are very deeply steeped in their religious tradition. Arrupe's faith was incredibly important to him, and that comes across in so many of his writings and his work as Superior General. But then at the same time, utilize that to challenge our students, but not make them feel unwelcome if they don't utilize the same faith perspectives or traditions. And so I think that's one of the difficulties that we're faced with, in trying to incorporate a faith that does justice at our Jesuit schools. So anyway, that was all a bunch of introduction, and there are 3 points that I'm going to be trying to make, as it said on the blurb about our comments today. The first of which has to do with the idea of narrative. And I think that, we're talking about narrative. It means, for me at this point, why is it, as we're talking about immersions, why is it that our students feel called to do some sort of immersion program? And I think that my comments also go for postgraduate volunteer work, challenging our students, those who work at university, working with students who are considering postgraduate volunteer work, asking them to truly dig deep and say, why do you feel called to go on this 3-day immersion, 5-day immersion, 10-day immersion, postgraduate volunteer program? And I think, some of you perhaps have interview processes where you talk to students who are thinking about doing these programs and say, tell me a little bit about why you're applying. And, I'm sure some people have the answer, well, my friend is doing it. My roommate, my older sibling went here, a few years ago and said, oh, you have to do this at some point. And I would never want anyone to be disingenuous and to lie and talk about, a deep faith moment if it isn't actually why they feel called to do something. But I think that, there's the surface level answer that people can give. But I think that if we allow students the opportunity to sit with the question of why do they feel called to do something, often over time, the internal digging that they're doing might uncover a deeper reality, a deeper sense of that call, perhaps in ways that they don't realize. But the importance of giving space for that deeper digging into this call. Perhaps someone has personally experienced a marginalization or some sort of bullying or something that happened to themselves or in terms of their relationship with parents where they push that away and they feel this call to go to this place or to talk to people or to learn about the marginalization. And they didn't realize that was where this call is coming from. Or someone who had a class, maybe in high school and now they're in college. And so they kind of feel this nudge to go on this immersion experience, but weren't able to vocalize it. And so they really took the time to dig deeply. And so a story that I want to share about Arrupe that has to do with this narrative, this call, looking back at one's own story, is an experience when Arrupe, prior to being in the Jesuits, was in medical school, and he was studying and going to be one of the top graduates of his class in medical school. And he and a friend were walking one day while he was in medical school, and they came upon a young boy who was sitting on the side of the road eating a piece of bread. And Arrupe said to the boy, oh, why are you eating this bread? You're going to spoil your dinner. And the young boy looked at him and he said, sir, this is the only meal that I'm going to have today. And Arrupe said, well, does your father not work? And the boy said, well, sir, my mother works. I don't have a father. My mother works and works multiple jobs just to try to make it possible for me to be able to have this one role. And Arrupe says in his writings that this experience, the face of a hungry boy, the first time he had encountered hunger of a child for the first time, stayed with him for the rest of his life. And I think in reading and studying Arrupe that this story is so foundational to the person he became and to his desire to work for justice. And ultimately, a few months later, after another experience he had at Lourdes, he ends up leaving medical school and joining the Jesuits. But to look back, as Arrupe, the older Arrupe, in telling these stories and looking back, is trying to realize, where did his call for a desire to work for justice come from? And identifying those points, those key moments of awakening. One of the things I talk about in the book is kind of this, and now I see, from the Gospel of John. And so I think that Arrupe was able to say, and now I see what the hunger of a child looks like. And for so many of our students in saying, now I see what this marginalization is, or this experience of racism, or the experience of bullying, or whatever it is. Now I see what this is, and I want to do more. I want to take it to the next step. I want to go on an immersion, or I want to do a postgraduate volunteer program. And so inviting people to kind of see how transformation begins from an experience, and looking back and inviting God into that in our prayer and our reflection, and saying, why do I feel this call? And potentially, I think people uncover aspects of that call that they didn't expect to when they first felt that nudge, that desire to apply for a program. Slightly related, this past July, I had the great blessing and privilege to undergo the 30-day exercises of St. Ignatius at Gloucester. And when you're applying for the 30-day retreat, for those who have done it, they ask, of course, why are you doing this? And you have to type out in your personal autobiography why you feel called to do this. And of course, I had prayed about it and reflected and talked to people. And so I had an answer that I typed up and turned in. And then as I was talking to my spiritual director in the months that followed prior to the retreat, again, revisiting this question, why do I feel called to do a 30-day retreat? And then the first day, we're there for orientation, and we're again asked in front of everyone, spend a little time talking about why are you here? Why are you called? And as I look back, I think my answer was different every time, because I continually brought that to prayer and reflection. Why in the world am I doing a 30-day retreat? And the answer that I gave as we got closer and closer to the experience was transformed in its sense of depth, where I was able to continually dig deeper into myself and say, why in the world am I feeling called by God to do this? And I think our immersion work, our justice work, can be the same way. But often, at least what I've seen is, I can only speak for myself, I rarely gave students the opportunity to kind of sit with that transformational element of a call. And so I think that Arrupe can teach us in reading his writings about working for justice, that the call to do this sort of work, to go on an immersion program, a postgraduate volunteer program, is something that we need to give people the space to kind of unpack. So again, my first of the 3 points deals with narrative and the importance of kind of coming to terms with who we are, as Arrupe did in his retelling of the story of the boy with bread moment, as I call it. Second point has to do with suffering. Many immersion experiences expose students, faculty, and staff to some element of suffering, whatever that is. Again, I'm going to try to speak as broadly as possible. I'm sure that there will be exceptions to everything that I'm about to say, but trying to speak in generic terms, often there is some sort of suffering that our students will see and come in contact with. And as a slight side note, I am working on a research project with some folks at John Carroll and up at Fordham, where we're interviewing faculty and staff who have done immersion programs. And a lot of this research that we're seeing is that faculty and staff have the same experience of transformation when it comes to suffering. When we ask faculty and staff who have accompanied students, what sort of things most stand out years later from this experience, they often talk about, again, experiences of suffering. When I saw this and I saw that, and these are adults who have many more years of life than our students, many more years of experience. Faculty who have studied issues and taught classes on these concepts are saying the same thing. When I saw this experience of suffering, it was very transformative for me in X, Y, and Z sort of way. So all that to say, I think suffering is something that in many of these immersion experiences is an aspect of that. And so how can we kind of create an environment where our students are able to process suffering in a way that's helpful? And so again, I would like to turn to an example from Arrupe, since that's what we're talking about. And many of you probably know, if you know anything about Arrupe, one of the things is that he was one of the people who was on the scene a couple miles outside of the city of Hiroshima when the atomic bomb was dropped by the United States, effectively ending World War II. And so Arrupe and his novices were a few miles outside the city, and we're in a valley, and we're spared the devastating effects of the bomb. And Arrupe says, the windows were blown out of the novitiate, and he was thrown across the room. And he and the novices went outside thinking that a bomb had fallen just outside the doorway because of the blast. And he says in his writings that they went up onto the hill, and before them they saw a decimated Hiroshima. And he describes the walls of fire that were ascending to the sky. And they spent hours waiting before they're able to go into the city to try to see if the Jesuit priests who were living at the center of the city had survived the blast. And once the walls of fire came down and they were able to rush into the city, they did so. And if you haven't read Arrupe's accounts of the horrific suffering that he observed when they went into the city, then it's definitely something that, if you're studying Arrupe or interested, you should read. And there's many stories that obviously don't have time to share a whole lot. But what I try to encourage students to imagine, I mean, it's in many ways unimaginable. But here's this guy who, no one really knows what has happened. There's some sort of big explosion. People are dying everywhere, walls of fire ascending to the sky. And so they rush into the city, and there are people, Arrupe describes, lying everywhere on the ground, begging for water because of the dehydration that their bodies felt, and flesh just coming off their bones. And so here's Arrupe trying to get to the center of the city first to check on the Jesuits. And he sees this immense amount of suffering that he is truly powerless to be able to help all these people, thousands of people laying around him in agony as they're working their way through the city. And so there's just this sense, Arrupe could have, just been overcome by a sense of hopelessness that he couldn't do anything because there's so much suffering. And I think that there's an aspect of hopelessness that sometimes grabs a hold of our students when they go to these realities and they see things that they're unable to fix, because the desire for people, many people, when they see a problem, is to fix it. And so trying to get our students to see that they're not going to these places to try to fix the problems that they observe, but to learn about or to see or to be witness to. But in the same way as Arrupe wasn't totally powerless to do nothing, he and the novices saved 150 people. They created these homemade they used doors to create homemade stretchers and put people on them and ran them until they were exhausted up into the novitiate, where they created a mock doctor's office where Arrupe used his medical knowledge to try to save people. And as I said, they saved around 150 people. And so even though on one hand, you can see suffering and feel a total powerlessness because there's nothing you can do for so many people, there's also an aspect where you can do something, and helping our students to realize that there are some things that they can do, whether it be advocacy or partnering with a local community partner. You learn about refugees when you're on your immersion and you come back and you say, where's a refugee center where I can volunteer and accompany people who are coming to a new country? And so, again, there are many things. Our schools, our immersion programs all look different. And so applying, whatever you can to the context that you live and work in, but helping our students to see that they can do some things, whether it's advocacy or helping out and volunteering. But ultimately the point, and there's a quote I heard many years ago, I'm not everyone, so I can't do everything, but I am someone, so I can do something. So how can we learn from Arrupe that we can only do what we can, but we should do something? Going back to the interviews that I was talking about in terms of the faculty staff interview project, the biggest thing that faculty and staff have said over and over in these interviews is, I wish we would have done more when we returned to school. And in a research project that we did prior to that, people talked about students who had done, now alumni of the institution, who had done immersions years later, said the same thing. I wish we would have done more when we returned to the place where we were coming from. And so this idea of kind of adapting and taking the experience that you see and allowing the suffering that you witness to be transformative so that you are not frozen and paralyzed by it, but in some way do something, I think is ultimately what we're challenging students to do. There's another aspect of kind of dealing with working through the suffering that one sees, and it's called a suffering presence, which is a term that Stanley Hauerwas, an ethicist at Duke University, likes to use. He has a book called Suffering Presence, which I think is really good. And so Hauerwas talks about at times when suffering is so great, the only thing we can do if we are invited by someone else to do so is to sit with them in their pain. And if I think about some of the immersion experiences that I've had where you're listening to people, refugees talking about coming into a new country or dealing with this, or migrant workers who are talking about what it means to be in a country and to not have the same access to facilities and to care and things like that. Challenging students to be like, hey, you're not going to be able to do something about what you're about to learn about. And so sit and listen and learn and humbly take in what it is that you're learning so that you can at some point apply that. And so I think that Hauerwas's notion of a suffering presence can be really important for our students to understand that it's not that you, again, are going in to do something on your immersion programs. Again, I know there are some programs where you are doing things, but in terms of fixing the problems that you see, that's not why we're there. That's not the role of a postgraduate volunteer. That's not the role of the person doing an immersion program. But at the same time, people will be seeing suffering. A number of years ago, and this is not related to an immersion program, but as an example of this idea of suffering presence that might be helpful. A number of years ago, I had a good friend whose father had a severe stroke, and myself and some other friends were out of town, and he called us and he said, hey, my father, who is only in his early 50s and in great health, had this stroke and he's in a coma, and we don't know what to do. Can you come and be with my family? And so myself and my friends drove back through the middle of the night and got back to Cleveland. And I remember the whole time thinking, like, how am I going to help my friend whose father is dying in a coma? What am I going to say? I'm not a doctor. I have no idea what the chances are that he'll make it. And so I remember thinking, I just need to be with him. And so I remember coming into his house, and we sat down on his father's bed, and we sat there for nearly an hour, and we didn't talk really at all. And I just kept telling myself that by being here, I am doing something. And after about an hour, my friend stood up and I gave him a hug, and we went and shared a meal together. A couple months later, his father did come out of his coma. And a number of years after that, my friend called me and he said, hey, we haven't ever really talked about this, but that time when my father had his stroke and I thought he was going to die, when you came to be with me and my family, it meant so much to me. Even though I knew you couldn't do something, you were just sitting there, and that was what we needed at that time. And so for me, that was a great example of the idea of a suffering presence and the fact that it can do something. And so kind of encouraging our students to realize that by doing these experiences, these immersions, by learning about how to advocate for people who are in difficult situations or facing injustices or facing racism or marginalization, that learning is part of the experience of being present to that suffering, so that you can eventually advocate for change or work for change in whatever way you're able to do. So that was the second point. Again, that suffering is an aspect of immersion experiences, but at the same time shouldn't paralyze us to do nothing, but like Arrupe, asking us, what can we do in these situations, even if it's post-trip, post-experience, to do something with the knowledge that we've learned. And finally, my third point has to do with solidarity, which in some ways brings full circle the presentation from last month that they did, because they mentioned kind of solidarity in my writing on solidarity, and the perspective that I kind of gained in doing research for my dissertation, which was on Arrupe. And ultimately, I think solidarity is like an asymptote. I'm a horrible math student, got C's in math in high school. But the idea of the asymptote, the X and Y axis, and the plotting of points of a curve, and ultimately in the asymptote, the lines that you're plotting will never reach either the X or the Y axis. And I say all that because I think that the idea of solidarity is something that can be so misused, or at least it was always misused by me, in that we're not trying to understand what it means to be a migrant worker or a refugee or the other, whatever the other is. That it's not about trying to understand what they're going through, because I think that that's such a horrible phrase to say to someone, I know what you're going through. I don't think we ever really know what someone else is going through. And so perhaps utilizing an understanding of solidarity that is always a process instead of an end product. And so I like to say that you are in a process of growing into solidarity with someone else by learning from them, by accompanying them, by witnessing to them, as opposed to talking about solidarity as an end product, because I don't think that we ever fully reach it. Again, I would like to share something from Arrupe. So Arrupe was in Japan for 25 years. We often talk about the atomic bomb as the big thing that he did in Japan, but he was there for so much more than the experience of the atomic bomb, in terms of learning about Japanese culture and learning how to be a missionary in Japan. And so I want to read something that he wrote in terms of his work in Japan. This is from his biography by Hedwig Lewis. Which paths, this is Arrupe speaking, which paths of inculturation was I to follow to reach the Japanese soul? The paths of Zen, in other words, the manner of serving tea, the manner of shooting with a bow, the manner of arranging a bouquet of flowers, the manner of defending oneself, of fencing, and finally, the way in which a poem is composed or written. Arrupe then goes on to say, to sum up, I would say if a person truly wishes to work with a people, he or she must understand the soul of that people. And I believe that kind of this idea of learning the soul is a much more, at this point in my life, I'd say, better way to describe what we are inviting people to do on immersion experiences. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that a student who travels to El Salvador for 10 days is going to learn the soul of the people of El Salvador. Nor would I even say that doing a year in Ecuador or 2 years in Micronesia is going to be able, that you're going to learn the soul of the people by being there. But it was Arrupe's goal as a missionary to Japan, spending 25 years there, 5 years working on trying to do the Japanese tea ceremony in the correct way, 5 years of studying the tea ceremony for many, many hours with the person who was teaching him in order to do that. And Arrupe's articulation of what he was doing was not, I'm trying to grow in solidarity with the people. It was, I'm trying to learn the soul of the people. And so I think that encapsulates so much more of what we're trying to do, to learn a little bit of language, to learn a little bit of custom, to learn a little bit of what it means to be that person day in and day out, aside from whatever marginalization or suffering that they're experiencing, that the people are a holistic people. We all have good days and bad days. And so challenging our students to see the people that they encounter, not as a caricature of whatever injustice that they're there to learn about, but as real people with relationships and lives, and that when you come for 10 days to this place, when you leave, there are still people there, and they were there before you, and they're there after you. And that learning these things is slow, but at the same time is crucial. Arrupe was a great linguist, but it took him a very long time. He writes to learn to be able to speak and write in Japanese. Ultimately, he wrote a number of books in Japanese on the exercises. But the process of learning is such a slow thing. And so again, obviously, I'm not saying that when we send a students group to El Salvador that they should learn all the Spanish language so that way they can be equipped. I think that adaptation to the reality of what students are able to do and what their what time and ability allows them to do when they're in a place, should definitely take precedent. But at the same time, how do we talk about what it is that we're going to do, which is really what I'm trying to get across in this example. My mentor, the late Howard Gray, has an excellent essay in the Jesuit Education Reader talking about soul education. And I think that this fits really well with what Arrupe is saying in terms of trying to learn the soul of the people. And Father Gray says in his article, by soul education, he means the, quote, appropriation of teaching, experience, and insight that mark a defining moment in a person's life. And I remember Father Gray talking about his article and this idea of a soul education when I had him in class. And I remember him putting up on the board that anima is Latin for soul. And he said, anima, from there we get the English word animate. And to animate something is to make it come alive. So in what way does a Jesuit institution, in what way does an immersion experience by extension animate a person and invite them to come to life, the anima, the soul? And in the same way for those who you are trying to learn the soul of, what is it that brings a person alive? What is it that brings them to the joys of the experiences? What important moments of their life? What brings them to life? And so I think the challenge of an immersion is not just to see the suffering of a person, but to see what is it that brings them to life? What is it that animates them? And that way, by extension, learning the soul of the people, so that again, we can see them as more than the suffering or the experience that we're there to learn about, but as fully people. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Poland as part of a class where we were learning about the Holocaust. And I remember over and over again, people that we would talk to would say, yes, it's important to be here to learn about the Holocaust and to go to the death camps, but this can't be just about Jewish death. It also needs to be about Jewish life. And so we went to synagogues. We went and talked to people about what it means to be Jewish in Poland today, and to learn, their celebrations, and to learn some of the food that Jewish people in Poland eat, and things like that. And so how can we see people as full people, as souls that are alive, as opposed to, again, just issues that they're facing concerning injustice and marginalization. And so by way of recap, getting down to the end here in terms of my own comments, and I'd love to invite questions or for you to share any of your experiences, even if it has nothing to do directly with what I've said topically. But just to recap, the three things that I hope that you take away from the talk today. The first one is about our individual narrative. which Arrupe invites us to reflect on. Why do we feel called to these experiences? The second thing is about suffering, and to give our students some tools to kind of process the suffering that they will most likely see on immersion programs, whether it be as a suffering presence and a listening, or as Arrupe to do what one can, even if it's volunteering or advocacy post-immersion, and to try to work that in. And the third aspect in terms of kind of talking about solidarity, not as a thing we're trying to reach, such that, you know, by sleeping on the floor, we're in solidarity with this group of people, but as more of a learning of the soul, what animates people, what brings them to life. And so hopefully, in terms of utilizing the Arrupe narrative, you can see how I'm trying to make those connections that Arrupe can teach us some of these aspects of immersion work. And my final comment, of course, the publisher would be disappointed in me if I didn't say at least a couple words about the book that I published, which is called Immersion Pilgrimage into Service. Much of the content that I talked about here in the last 30 minutes comes from the book, in terms of kind of taking Arrupe's narrative, weaving into the stories that I've heard from people doing postgraduate volunteer work, and also immersion programs and my experiences there. And I attempted to set up a book that would walk people through the developmental different states of preparing for an immersion or discerning postgraduate volunteer work, looking at, again, narrative, prayer, some of the other aspects of the book that I didn't talk about as much. The savior complex and volunteerism is something there, kind of in the last chapter, honoring one's experience. How is it that we can incorporate immersion and postgraduate volunteer work into our lives? And so my hope is it is a text and a reflection guide that that people could use in immersion prep or in their courses, if they're teaching courses that have to do with a traveling to a place, a component of injustice, and looking at issues of marginalization. So I have rambled on for longer than I thought I would. But what I'd like to do is either, if you have a question for me, or if you would like to share something, again, please feel free to do so. What I thought, to keep this organized, I don't know how many people are on the call at the moment, but if you want to speak in the chat box, just type your name. If you have a question, then you can type the question. And then either Aaron or I will look at the question. And that way we don't have people kind of jumbling around and trying to jump in, and one person in a very kind way says, "Oh, I'm sorry, you were speaking and I wasn't." So if you want to speak, you can go ahead and put your name in the chat box. If you have a question, you can go ahead and put the question in, and I'll do my best to answer it. Or it could be a question for anyone else in the group as well. What kind of, how do you deal with this issue in terms of immersions or something like that? So I'm going to stop talking, give people a moment to think, and you're welcome to type in your questions or thoughts. Thank you, Mike, for your question. What kind of advocacy after the trip is best? And I'll certainly also open this up to some of the other folks who are in charge of immersion programs at different institutions. So I can only speak from the experiences that I've seen. One of the places I took students as part of a course was to Immokalee, Florida, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, to learn about migrant workers, the immigration system, issues of injustice in terms of fair wage. And so for me, I challenged the students when they got back. It was a course. And so the final project of the course was to create some sort of educational advocacy for other students at the school and for the local community about what it is that they had learned. And so each year the students did something different, which is great for them to utilize their creativity. But my goal in that course was educational. And a lot of the things that we did in Immokalee are about education and awareness, which the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, one of our partner groups, often said, what we want to do is teach you what's going on here so you can go back and be a voice that can add to ours, so that you can learn to speak up and to go to a protest, or to show people what's going on. Because I think so often with the injustices in these places, it's unknown. And even in a world of social media where things can be known instantly across the globe, so much of the true reality of what is going on in places is often obscured or limited in terms of knowledge. So from my experience, I would say some sort of educational advocacy. I do think, you know, another place that I was able to visit with students is Louisville, Kentucky, and we worked with refugees there, one of the examples I used earlier, and challenging students to say, hey, you know, we have refugees coming to Cleveland, which is where I was living at the time and living now. We have refugees coming to Cleveland all the time. You don't have to go to Louisville to work with refugees. You can volunteer and work with refugees here in Cleveland, and it's, you know, it's the same thing. So getting students to kind of go from the, you know, I love my immersion group, and you know, we do a lot of affirmations on the last night, and everything's great, and this and that, to take it to the next step, and to say, no, it's ultimately not about you. It's about the experience that's so much bigger than you and the reality of other people. And so, how can you find other outlets for that energy, that desire to work for justice in your local community, or potentially in terms of postgraduate volunteer service? How can you look for a program that is designed to continue working for justice in this area that has inspired you? And so those are some of the things that, you know, again, I have never been in charge of a program, and so my experiences are somewhat limited. But that's what I would offer. I think it's a great question. As I mentioned, you know, in researching, we interviewed over 100 faculty, staff, and administrators from John Carroll, and at this point, about 20 from Fordham. That part of the project is ongoing, and a lot of faculty, staff, and administrators have said the biggest regret about Immersions is that they didn't do more to kind of continue the learning of students that should be a part of these experiences. So thank you, Mike, for your question. Let's move on to the next one. Question from Anne. I'm just going to read this just in case some folks are not able to see, or, you know, are driving or doing something else. But Anne's question: I'm curious if folks have any good resources that they've used on the theme of suffering and helping groups explore that more deeply, particularly readings, discussion starters, and processes, etc. And I'll invite anyone, if you want to either verbally share or type into the chat box to Anne's question. I think is a great question. Thinking if I have anything off the top of my head to add, but if you have anything, please add it. And I'm just reading Michael's question. In terms of inviting people to see and bear witness to suffering, how important do you think it is to connect the suffering that participants witness during immersion experiences that they have had in their own life? Example, in orientation preparation. This helping people get in touch with their own struggles, vulnerability, open them up to being aware of and recognize sharing vulnerability, enhance connection, relationship, and therefore connection to the soul of the person in solidarity. I personally, I think yes, in answer to Michael's question. One of the other things, aside from teaching, that I've had the privilege of doing is working with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps International in Rostro de Cristo, which is a program that sends volunteers to Ecuador to live and work there for a year. And so for many years, for around 10 years, I was at the orientation session for both of those programs, which was a 2-week orientation program. And on the second night, one of the things I would do is talk a little bit about Arrupe's story that I shared with you in terms of the boy with bread moment, and then create a space for sharing where everyone who wanted to, certainly weren't forced to do so, but everyone who wanted to could share kind of their own boy with bread moments. And for people who were preparing to do international service for one or two years, they often had incredibly powerful stories of why they felt called ultimately to do these programs. And in terms of their own experiences, either what they themselves had felt, again, injustice towards them, marginalization towards them, things they had witnessed on immersion programs, things they had learned in classes. And so my hope in creating the space for that was to help create a community where people could start having those discussions early on in the formation. And people often at the end said how important that opportunity was for them to kind of let some of their guard down. I mean, you're coming from people all over the United States, sometimes some from outside the United States, to come together and get to know each other for 2 whole weeks and to learn about each other, and then suddenly to go separate ways. And if you weren't in the same program or going to the same community, you probably would never see those people again. And so how is it that you create a sense of community for people who have the same passions and want to work for justice and are willing to take a chance and to do these programs, but to create a space of sharing for that. So I found it to be incredibly powerful. A number of times I was brought to tears by some of the things that people said. For those who have been involved in ISN's high school Arrupe summits, one of the things I do a similar thing there, and obviously the expectations are a little bit different for high school students sharing some of their boy with bread moments, but again, incredibly powerful things that people have shared that I think are moving and great examples for the rest of us. You know, realizing sometimes people haven't had a chance to talk about boy with bread moments, as I refer to them. Again, whether it's something that they witnessed or something they experienced, and just giving young folks the chance and the space to open up about these very powerful, life-changing experiences is just so humbling. And so I do think, and again, your context, your situations, this would look different for you depending on what your immersion program preparation looks like, the age of your students, et cetera. But in some way, whether it be verbally or in a journal or writing, inviting students to reflect on that ultimate question: why are you here? And how has your life kind of brought you to this moment, whether it be a positive or negative? And so thank you for that question. Woody's question: we're looking to re-envision our immersion trips here at Seattle Prep. So these insights from Arrupe have provided great context, the foundation to work with. I'm glad, thank you. Does ISN keep a bank of resource page of immersion trips from all Jesuit schools? I think that's a great thing for ISN to think about. So Erin, is there a bank of information for immersion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't have a list that is accessible on the website or anything like that. What I can offer you is connecting you to other immersion coordinators in the network. I would be really happy to do that. I can share my email in the chat. We also have existing listservs, both at the higher ed and secondary ed levels, which is also a really great way to reach out to colleagues in the network who are doing similar work within their school. So I'd be happy to do that. And, those listservs are places that I've seen great conversations, even about ideas of new sites in light of the pandemic and things like that. So Woody, generally I'll share my email in the chat, and Woody, I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Thanks.
And of course, I can jokingly say there is a great resource. I had to make the publisher happy. Mac, thank you for your question also. I agree, we tend to think individualistically and Arrupe in terms of having an order, the Jesuit order. And I do think, as you're saying here, connecting immersion participants to something bigger, helping them to realize that they're not alone, I think is very important. One of the other aspects of kind of the importance, I think, of looking at why someone feels called is not only in looking to the future, but at some point in the future, so many of our students who have gone on an immersion experience have come back with that energy and that passion, kind of like that retreat high from immersions. They want to do amazing things. And then the first time one of their, distant relatives or uncles are like, why in the world did you waste a week doing that? Or those people don't matter, or they just filled your head with a bunch of crap there and it's not really true. And there's this deflating realization that not everyone has the same passion, and kind of weathering, I think, that first hump, that first storm where people encounter people that don't think of the same way as them or haven't had that same realization can be very deflating. And then I think a lot of students kind of go into their turtle shell and they're like, well, I had the passion, but maybe they're right, and I'll retreat back. And perhaps at some point they kind of come out of the shell again. But helping people realize, as you're saying, that community is there. And I think that our boy with bread moments can become kind of anchors to weather the storm of doubt that people try to put into our heads about the fact that immersions are a waste of time, or your discernment about a postgraduate volunteer program. Why in the world would you ever leave the United States when there's so much work to be done here? All these things that so many of us have heard other people say. And there are valuable things there, but I think ultimately digging deeper to why is the person saying this and what are they getting at, and creating a community of people to discuss these things, I think is really important for encouraging our students to not give up. Question from Connor. Do you have any thoughts on how to strike a balance between advertising the experiences, opportunities of immersions, maybe encouraging those who have never considered something like it, while also respecting the communities that we'll be visiting and working with? Connor, a wonderful question. I don't have an answer, but I have a couple of kind of thoughts on this. One of the sections in the book, one of the chapters, is on the use of images and photos that people often take on immersion experiences. And I talk about how when I first started to do immersions, I was, really wanted to take a lot of pictures because it was a class I was teaching, and if I couldn't fill the class, it wasn't going to go, and it was just an elective, so it didn't count for core credit. So I had to basically convince students to pay a lot of money and take an extra class that had a lot of writing without them getting core credit for it. And so I was like, well, I'll take a bunch of pictures, and pictures of the students playing with children is going to be a big hit, and all this and that. And now I look back and I think, wow, that was just not good. And so I talk about kind of that, my own development of seeing that. And so I think images can be incredibly damaging in terms of, our goal ultimately is to create an experience that is in some way meaningful for all involved, not just our students, but for those that we encounter, without marginalizing them further. And I think a lot of what I was doing was marginalizing people further by utilizing these images. So in terms of advertising, I think one of my personal heroes in Immokalee one time said, when you go back and talk to people about your experience, he said this to the immersion participants, when you go back and talk about our experience, talk about us in the same way that you would a friend. And it was so simple and beautiful that I was like, wow, that's exactly what it is. How do I talk about a friend? That's how I would talk about the people in Immokalee. Not as a bunch of people who need me to go there and save them or anything like that, but simply like people. These are people just like me that I'm going to talk about just like I would someone that I care about. So I'd say all that because I think for me the question is, how do I utilize images in an appropriate way that doesn't marginalize? How do I tell stories about people that don't reduce them to the injustice that they're speaking, that they're experiencing, but speaking about them in a way that's honest and caring and respectful of their soul? And so again, I think from school to school, program to program, somewhere in between those poles that I mentioned lies a way to advertise in a just way. But I think that's a crucial question that, you have the big dogs in administration. If you're at a university, you have the board who is hounding you to kind of prove that this is an educational thing that money should be spent on. And then you have, perhaps a boss or chair of a program at high schools, trying to, at some point, if you're not doing immersions this year in terms of COVID, convincing parents and others that it's safe to now be able to travel. And so trying to create proof. If things are taught as a course, you have to have some sort of assessment. I mean, these are all difficult things, especially when you're trying to get money for your programs. And so, the board doesn't always understand what it means to do things in a way that doesn't continue the perpetuation of marginalization. And I'm not saying that to insult the board. That's not, necessarily their area. All of you are the people trained in understanding what it means to kind of treat people with dignity and respect in immersion work. If you haven't done immersion work, you're probably not going to speak that language. And so you have to translate that into something that the board or people that are in charge of finances, people that do advertisements in yearbooks or kind of pamphlets that are being sent out. So asking questions, what sort of images are people using when they say, come to Arrupe High School, come to Arrupe University, here we do immersions. Asking questions like, what are they actually saying? What are tour guides saying at your institutions about immersions? I think that kind of goes on and on. There are lots of great questions that we should be considering. Mike Gable, are you familiar with the research by Dr. Robert Priest and Dr. Hunter on immersion trips? They're key members and Protestant scholars in the American Society of Missiology. I am not. I will look them up after this call. I am not familiar with them. And I'll just read Donald's, again, I don't know if on the recording, people are able to access the commentary. So Donald says, this is not a question, but an experience people have had in immersions to Mexico that I ran for many years. The people there would tell us every time that they couldn't believe that we went to see them and acknowledged that they were real and not alone, and that those of us from someplace, quote, up north visited them. The participants in the immersion were always blown away by the reaction to their visit. When they got home, they carried that experience with them and immersed themselves at home when they could. Thank you, Donald, for that. I think that that's, inviting students to see how can you carry the experience of the immersion, whether it be witnessing an injustice or whether it be a positive story. Again, immersions are not all depressing. I mean, there are some really, I think, powerful positive experiences that people can take away. Again, I don't want to pigeonhole one school's experiences or one place, one location, but there are a lot of great things that can be witnessed and can be attested to when people return back to their schools. So thank you all for your questions and thoughts and for attending this event today. As I started off by saying, I think that these are really important questions. And I think that the pandemic, which has been horrible for so many people all over the world, I think that there are some positives that we can take out of that. And one of them is the chance to step back because immersions couldn't go, which again, I very much believe in immersions. I think that they're very important. Postgraduate volunteer programs, I think, are very important. But at the same time, not being able to do something sometimes gives us the opportunity to step back and say, how are we doing things and how could we do things better? And so for a number of people I've talked to that were in charge of immersion programs at high schools and colleges have had to be very creative in terms of kind of continuing the same idea of immersions, but at the same time, they've been like, okay, this is back to the drawing board. What are we trying to do here? How could we do it better? Talking to people at other schools, learning from each other. There's such a powerful collection of people doing this work at Jesuit high schools and colleges across the country, and you all have so much to give to helping each other to be able to do this work even more effectively. And so, as I don't know who famously said, the first problem that one has is to say, we do this because it's always been done this way. And I think that the pandemic has given us a chance to step back and say, well, we may have always done it this way, but perhaps this is time to do something differently or to do something in another way. So I'm, again, very thankful. I'm just going to type my email address into the chat, jimmy@gmail.com. If there's anything that I can do for you, if you're interested in terms of talking about the book or utilizing the book at your institution, I'd love to talk to you more about that. If there's anything that you need from me, I'm happy to help. And I turn it back over to Erin for any final comments. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Thanks for being here and for sharing your work and your expertise. I'm going to share a couple of upcoming ISN events, campaigns, two of which start next week with Lent. One is our annual Lenten series, which includes daily emails from really incredible writers across the network. And then the second is a weekly Lenten email that is tied to the Laudato Si action platform. So if you or perhaps your institution are involved in the Laudato Si action platform in any way, it could be a good supplemental piece. So I'll drop that in the chat as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to share our Ignatian Family Teaching for Justice webpage. It is coming soon for the full update for 2022, but if you don't have the dates on your calendar, they are October 22nd through the 24th. We are going to be opening registration mid-March, so keep an eye out for that. In addition, we are moving our speaker applications to the spring semester. So that application, especially for students, the application period will take place between mid-March and mid-May. So for those of you who bring student delegations and may know of student speakers, please share with them that that is coming soon. And if you're not familiar with the Ignatian Family Teaching for Justice, I would encourage you to check out our website and reach out to me with any questions. I'd be really happy to share with you. It's our annual social justice conference that takes place in Washington, D.C. And in addition to our days of speakers and workshops, includes an advocacy day on Capitol Hill. So that's the elevator pitch for it, but of course there's much more that I'd be happy to share. But in light of time, I am going to let you all go. Again, we've recorded this session, so I will share a recording by Monday, hopefully at the latest, and you can feel free to share this video with folks who you think it might be relevant to, who may not have made it. Thanks so much all. Thanks, Jimmy.